Greetings once again. It's a pleasure to be back and it's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you under the African Farmer Voices. And one of the key conversations that I'm bringing today for you is to understand the development that have happened in the pharma industry, and specifically I'm going to look at a case of what's happening in Kenya and what development we had this week. So to start us off, on Tuesday this week, we had the Ministry of Health launching the local manufacturing strategy for health products and technologies. A good move, a good strategic document, and actually guided by a clear understanding that there has to be a national strategy led by the government to spur growth in the industry. However, why is it that I'm talking about this? I'm talking about it because this is an important conversation. From COVID, from time immemorial, we've always been talking about how do we ensure that Kenyans and general public have access to health products and technologies reliably, quality products, but also safe products that are affordable to them. And that is a key imperative that makes us want to invest in the pharmaceutical industry and makes it necessary that we invest in the industry as it should be. That is a good move for us. So when the government decided to come up with a strategy for the industry to promote local manufacturing of health products and technologies, there has been iterative engagement with different stakeholders with the essence of ensuring that we have a strategy that reflects the realities of the market, but also that proposes what should be done, who should do it, and how it should be done to ensure that we power the growth of the industry, mostly with a focus on local manufacturing. The essence of it is, in case we don't have a reliable local manufacturing industry, we are going to be exposed and we're going to end up in a situation where whenever we have outbreaks like we had for COVID-19, reliability in access becomes compromised, and therefore then we are exposed, and that is a risk that we don't want to get to. On the other end, when you look at the industry also has an economic imperative in terms of driving growth, driving jobs creation and employment, and therefore there's more to it than just making medicines available. So why is it that I'm talking about this conversation around the strategy that was rolled out? I think it's a good move to have it, but I also have reservations and concerns on what kind of document we had published and the document that is going to be implemented moving forward. First thing, the reason as to why that is a problem is I doubt the implementability of the strategy as it is, and that presents a challenge for all of us in terms of moving forward. In my professional life and in my career, one key thing that I've known about a strategy is a plan of action that looks at your aspirations, your desires, and your ambition and where you want to go to. But on the other end, it has to be grounded on your realities and the current dynamics of what you are contending with. And that starts from understanding what is the context we are operating in, what are the challenges we are contending with, what are the opportunities that lie out there, whether internally or among the stakeholders that we're engaging with. How do we aggregate and galvanize all these possibilities from challenges, weaknesses, but also bring in the possibilities and the opportunities that we have as an industry, and guided by that, come up with implementable action items that will actually give us an opportunity to implement them, to take advantage of the opportunities, to address the challenges, and most importantly, to create the foundational pillar that will actually ensure sustainability. Everybody talks about China's development over the last 30 years or so. It had been a long incremental strategy that has moved people to where they are at the moment. Are we doing the same in our development, or are we not doing it? So why is this conversation important? A couple of items that I looked at in terms of the strategy document that came out that I think is important for us to look at and ask ourselves, where did we drop the ball? And probably what can we change, and what are the gaps that I see in this strategy document? Number one, the problems that were diagnosed. When you look at the contextual assessment, if you're talking about local manufacturing, it has to speak to the realities of the local manufacturers. One key thing for local manufacturers, number one, has to be what is the cost of setting up a plant? What incentives are being made available for them to be able to set up the operations? On the other end, what is the cost of actually running that plant? And once I'm running a plant, a manufacturing facility, I must be able to produce product that will be sold. How do I get market to sell that product? And if we look at all those enablers, we're able to understand where the problem is for the manufacturers. And therefore the question should be, what are the barriers and the hurdles for them to be able to produce products? What are the barriers that are actually impeding them being able to set up facilities? Some of those are covered in the strategy. We are looking at financing. We are looking at access to market shaping strategies and all that, which is fantastic. But the cost of operation, when you look at it, we have an unresponsive tax regime that is actually making the cost of tax and the cost of operating because of the taxes being so bad for industry that it doesn't support their growth or where they have to be. But at the same time, on the other end, when we talk about market access, the government says we put in preferential procurement mechanism. Fantastic to have it in theory, but when you look at the practicalities of it, if I am a manufacturer, Kenyan manufacturer, I'll get a 15%, 20%, we would say margin of preference in terms of pricing. If I was just to stop manufacturing with a 15% margin of preference to start importing the same product in a country where the cost of production is lower, I'm going to get still a 10% price preferential margin. So the question is, does that 5% difference in price consideration and preference give me an advantage to invest, let's say for example 100 million to start a manufacturing facility, or get 20 million to import and sell? Those are considerations that the policy needed to have addressed. Some of the gaps are still there. When you talk about the problem being affordability and availability of medicines, we understand conversations on pricing. But the price of a product always aggregates the cost of producing it, the margins that are put into place depending on the cycle in terms of the chain of supply of the product, and ultimately the patient has to pay for it, whether they're buying the product or the government is paying through insurance mechanism, private or public. Across that ecosystem, when you are looking at affordability, you don't manage affordability at the last point when the medicine at the shelf. You have to manage it in looking at what are the key cost drivers for this. That would go back to the production cost that we were talking about in the first statement. When you look at the manufacturers, these are some of the gaps that have still not been addressed in that particular strategy document, and I think there's more room for us to engage and have conversations honestly, deliberately, but also with objectivity on where we need things to get to as an industry. When you look at the solutions that are proposed, the solutions are more operational, more programmatic, which then begs the question, are we in program management or rather actually getting to support the actual production of products? And why do I have a problem with this? We have a steering committee that is proposed to be established, a fantastic move. What are the timelines for establishment? Who has the mandate to establish it? It said it's the president, but now that gets us to the context. These strategies rolled out in June 2026. 2027, we are all sure we are getting into an election period, and even the country as it is, everybody is now looking at political dynamics and the moves of where things are. That is already a gap. So then, will it be implemented? When the strategy, when the steering committee is established, do we go to the next level of getting the different operational structures? That might be a challenge from a context standpoint, and we need to do better in terms of getting it to move. That is the timelines I talk about. The solutions that are proposed, some of them do not talk about issues. For example, I talk about tax. Nobody has talked about it in the policy. We've just said there's a problem, it needs to be addressed. We've talked about regulatory systems. The regulation mechanisms need to be addressed, and that is our opportunity. How do we do it? And also when we talk about regulation, and I'll do a follow-up video on this regulatory conversation, is maturity level 3 is good for the regulator, but it should not be a regulatory issue but also a market shaping issue for the market. When you're saying the regulator has to meet WHO ML3 standards, fantastic, we love that, but also has to speak to the realities of the industry. How do we support the industry to grow at the same rate as the regulator is growing? So that then we are not strengthening the regulation to kill local industry, because some of the other functions of the industry will not be addressed without those mechanisms in place. Where the rubber hits the road is when we talk about resourcing the strategy, resourcing the implementation. We have an unfortunate situation that the budget that has been proposed is around $1.7 billion, out of which currently from the projections and the suggestion of whatever the money that has been committed, we have only $38 million commitment by the government with focus on smart vaccine manufacturing. Development partners have committed around $210 million. That is only still linked to the same vaccine manufacturing to an extent and a couple of other items. All the other pillars that have been outlined in the strategy as implementable, there's no financial commitment from the government, there's no financial commitment from the development partners. If you have a budget of $1.7 billion and you have $0.2 billion, already you're saying, I have a deficit of $1.5 billion. So if you can't own your plan, how do you expect it to be implemented? And that moves to the next question, where we ask ourselves, when you look at the dynamics in the development world, whenever the government has a plan, where the government has put its money is where other stakeholders come in. And that is why when the government put $38 million in vaccine manufacturing as the only area where the government commitment is already available, then it means all the other development partners would draw towards that particular pillar. What happens to the other pillars that are left out? Orphans. Yet we need to develop the industry. These are conversations that we must be willing to have, and we must be able to move towards the next level. The second piece is resource mobilization. It's been talked about the people we can get money out of and from to be able to implement the strategy. But the strategy on how actually to mobilize those resources, the accountabilities and the people mandated to do it are not defined. It is amorphous. Therefore, we end up with a document with no ownership, no accountabilities, and therefore it is just a document. Will we get to where we want to be from the 30% local manufacturing? Hopefully, and I want us to get to that level, but where we are with the strategy as it is for now, as structured, there are still gaps, and those gaps need to be addressed. The only way to address them is, first of all, acknowledge that the problems as they exist cannot be solved with the strategy that we currently have. Solving it is acknowledging that we need to have solutions that are pragmatic enough, and two, putting our money where our mouths are and saying, if we want to drive, for example, development in research and development, the government must be the first person to put money in it, because when you seed it, different players come in because they already trust your commitment. Without that, we keep talking, we'll keep dancing in circles. Ultimately, we never get what we desire. Thank you for the conversation, and I'm keen on keeping us ahead of the journey as we keep driving engagements to drive growth of the industry in Africa. Thank you.